Sup y'all, and welcome to Global Interactions Part 6. In this video, we'll look specifically at the Asian giants of China and Japan, the beasts of the East, and the search for stability in East Asia. While the Western European states emerged more powerful than ever by the late 17th century, the East Asian powers did not progress nearly as quickly, and were considerably surpassed by Europe in terms of wealth and influence. This supports the statement that those who do not or cannot adapt to changing conditions will become weaker, obsolete, or extinct. So to begin, we'll first look at the Asian nations and how their culture's adaptations to changing global conditions put them at a disadvantage to the Europeans, answering this key question: why didn't China or Japan establish overseas empires as the Europeans had? To best explain this, we'll focus on three key reasons: climate, culture, and geopolitics. Recall that the Little Ice Age was a period of cooling that occurred by some accounts around 1350 through 1850 CE, which followed the medieval warm period that had ended around 1250 CE. Geopolitically speaking, Europe contained multiple competing countries, whereas China was a singular and fairly cohesive empire. As a result of the Little Ice Age, directly or indirectly, the Europeans focused outward, seeking new land, food, and riches. Concurrently, China, and to a greater extent Japan, focused inward. China, in contrast to Europe, was a vast empire seeking to protect what it already had. As temperatures dipped and resources grew scarce, the Ming ended their overseas expeditions.
Now bear in mind, these expeditions were finished before the Europeans had even begun to sail much beyond the Mediterranean Sea or into the Atlantic Ocean.
For comparison, this is an artist's rendition of Zheng He's flagship spanning greater than 400 feet, and as you can see, it completely dwarfed the size of Columbus's Santa Maria.
If the Chinese had such a head start, why didn't they discover and conquer the Americas? The answer is, not geography.
Yes, well!
Interestingly, these expeditions were mostly political or militaristic, not economic in nature. Yes, they received money from land taxes and tribute, but not trade, since they felt they had all that they needed. Keep in mind, the Ming, and all Chinese society, was dominated by the values of Confucianism far more than the motivations of mercantilism. Due to cooler temperatures, the Mongols, to the north, continually harassed the Chinese, forcing the Ming to rebuild the Great Wall. By the 1500s, China was challenged along virtually all their borders, and their power began to decline. The Portuguese began showing up en masse, eager to gain land, riches, and to spread Christianity. Many of the Chinese referred to them as ocean devils. Even though the Ming focused inward, they continued to expand trade, even engaging in the Columbian Exchange. From the east came Japanese, eager to tap into China's great wealth, but increasingly defiant and unwilling to pay the tribute required for official trade. Instead, they turned to plunder and piracy on the seas, whilst Japanese samurai landed in China to pillage towns and villages. The Ming fought back by prohibiting trade with China, but this ban primarily only led to more smuggling. And of course, the Ming were repeatedly harassed by the Mongols to the north. The need to protect their borders on multiple fronts drained China's treasury and led to unrest as well as an increased sense of xenophobia for the Chinese. By the 1600s, under the Tokugawa shogunate, the Japanese entered into a period of isolation and stopped trading with the Chinese. Regardless of the changing times, the Ming emperors maintained vast courts and wasted valuable tax money by supporting the entourages, living a life of excess luxury. In the early 1630s, a terrible famine ravaged the country, leading to massive deaths and massive revolts. Years later, a commoner named Li Zicheng led a rebellion. As floods, droughts, and a smallpox epidemic amplified the human disaster, support for Li Zicheng increased. In 1644, he captured Beijing, while the despondent Ming emperor hanged himself on a nearby hill, thus ending the Ming dynasty. Now, while Li Zicheng was ransacking Beijing, the Ming leaders had called for help. They sought assistance from a loosely united group of nomadic northerners known as the Manchus, being as they were from a region known as Manchuria. The Manchus quickly overthrew Li Zicheng and his army in 1644 and established what would be the last imperial dynasty of China, the Qing, meaning the pure dynasty. The Qing, although technically foreigners, adopted many Chinese ways. Nonetheless, Manchus were given precedence when it came to government positions. Additionally, intermarriage between the Chinese and Manchus was forbidden. Also, the Chinese men were forced to wear their hair in a braid, or called a queue, keeping consistent with the Manchu custom. The Qing engaged in massive military campaigns, subduing resistance in the south while expanding their territory to the west. Now, in this map, you can see the extent of the Ming lands. Then compare that with the lands taken by the height of the Qing dynasty. In case you missed it the first time, here it is again. Now, aside from the territorial gains, the Qing sought to create a more cohesive nation and suppress Christianity as well as the Jesuits. They also outlawed the practice of foot binding, a common practice by the wealthy in some regions of China. With the effects of the Little Ice Age, the continued isolation of the Japanese, and the rise and expansion of the Europeans, the Qing stagnated for more than a century.
Look at this 16th century map of Japan. Considering the 5 themes of geography, it would seem that the Japanese had all the elements necessary to begin an age of exploration.
Japan was located in the core region of the world prior to the ascendancy of Europe, clearly the richest region at that time. Japan was also located near China, acquiring the best technology far before the distant lands. Plus, they had to compete with China for power and control of the area. Japan was also able to trade for the goods from China that were desired by all the countries and empires of the Old World. And this was beneficial for Japan, a land with relatively few natural resources, which would make it much more probable for its people to look for other lands in order to gain wealth. Furthermore, Japan is an island surrounded by the Pacific Ocean, logically giving them a maritime culture.
Now, Japan did have ocean-going vessels, and China did in fact engage in massive overseas expeditions. However, these beasts of the East never did establish overseas empires as the Europeans had. We'll take a look at Japan's feudal government.
Now, the samurai were analogous to the knights, living by Bushido, literally meaning the way of the warrior, a moral code of honor and service, to the daimyo, who were analogous to the nobles, powerful territorial lords with hereditary titles, subservient only to the shoguns, who were analogous to the monarchs, often acting as dictators over their lands, some of whom were appointed by the emperor, although the emperor largely held a ceremonial position, a figurehead, who usually wielded very little power. The age of warring states dominated Japan from 1467 to 1568. In European terms, that would be from around 20 years before Bartholomew Diaz's voyage around the southern tip of Africa, up to the start of the Dutch revolt against Catholic Spain. Now, Japan was divided among warring daimyo clans fighting for land and power, while experiencing cooler temperatures and fewer available resources. The Portuguese were the first to reach Japan in the late 1400s, bringing with them their religion, converting many Japanese to Christianity. And they also brought firearms. Even though gunpowder was invented in China, the Portuguese guns provided many daimyo with a military advantage as long as they were willing to part with their samurai ways just a little bit. For centuries, Japan was a fragmented, multi-state nation until the emergence of one man. We can largely credit Japanese unification and expansion beginning under Oda Nobunaga, a daimyo who set out in the 1560s to unite Japan under his control. He built a powerful army equipped with guns and cannons under the command of a military genius named Hideyoshi. Together they conquered rival daimyo in central Japan, capturing the city of Kyoto. By the early 1580s, Nobunaga controlled almost half of the provinces in Japan. However, he was ambushed by one of his generals and committed suicide to avoid the disgrace of being captured. Continuing Nobunaga's goals, Toyotomi Hideyoshi either conquered or won the allegiance of all remaining daimyo, uniting Japan. After assuming power, he set out to make Japan a true nation-state by expelling Christian missionaries and preventing the peasants from using weapons, so that way they would be unable to wage a rebellion against him. Hideyoshi's main ambition, however, was to conquer China. In order to do so, he had to travel through neighboring Korea. Having been denied a safe passage through the lands by the Koreans, He invaded them in the early 1590s. Korea was essentially a vassal state of China, meaning they paid China a yearly tribute to remain somewhat independent. The Chinese aided the Koreans with troops and supplies. Additionally, the Koreans used their ingenious turtle ships with iron hulls to win several key naval battles against the Japanese. Together, they successfully stopped the Japanese invasion. Hideyoshi died in 1598 due to complications after contracting the plague, which brought Japan back to a position without a dominant leader. The man who would challenge for supremacy over Japan was a daimyo named Tokugawa Ieyasu. Now this painting depicts the Battle of Sekigahara, which took place in 1600 with a total of around 160,000 men facing each other. This was the largest battle ever on Japanese soil and ended with a total victory for the Tokugawa. Now, in 1603, Tokugawa Ieyasu forced the emperor to name him shogun and forced all daimyo to swear loyalty to him. This began an era called the Tokugawa shogunate, in which Japan entered a period of around 250 years of isolation, keeping the status quo with almost no progress. In order to remain in power, the Tokugawa shoguns outlawed Christianity, and they prevented the daimyo from building castles, who also had to provide manpower for the shoguns. Additionally, the daimyo had to spend every other year in Edo, which is Tokyo today, and their families had to stay in Edo permanently. Just like the great Chinese general Sun Tzu had said, "Keep your friends close and your enemies closer." Now, during this time period, only one Dutch ship was allowed to trade with them once a year, so the wealthy and powerful could still have a taste of the good stuff. Now, the Dutch were allowed to trade because they didn't push religion on the Japanese, they merely wanted to trade.
So to sum it up, the reasons why the beasts of the East did not establish overseas empires can, in some capacity, be explained by cultural inclinations causing them to focus inward due to global cooling, whereas the Europeans had focused outward.
Am I the meanest?
Sure enough.
Am I the prettiest?
Sure enough.
Am I the baddest mofo low down around this town?
Sure enough.
Well, who am I?
Sure enough.
Who am I?
Sure enough.
I can't hear you.
Sure enough.
The Shogun of Hard.